Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
When mentioning social media or any other form of modern communications,
newfangled,
this new thing, the Facebook, we can sometimes encounter the attitude of, oh, we don't really do that, or we don't bother with that, which I do find is a bit odd, but it's always a sort of curious expansion upon that response, and it can be interesting to hear, but it often can be quite discouraging.
Yeah, I think because we spend so much of our time thinking about church comms and digital comms that it can be discouraging, and we can almost hear that and equate it with, well, we don't really care about reaching people. We're quite comfortable here with what we're doing. But whilst that's what it can feel like, that's probably not the case. I think we can acknowledge that's probably not the most generous reading of what they're saying there.
Yeah. And actually, I do find if you have the chance, sometimes you don't have the chance, but if you have the chance to chat with these people who are making these comments, but it can lead to a really interesting sort of conversation, and you find out sort of a lot of the reasoning behind it. And it can be helpful to ask questions or unpack sort of why the church doesn't really want to be involved in anything that we would put under the umbrella of church comms, or maybe they do, but they just don't feel that they can.
Yeah, and this, it can be that there's this pressure of churches to do so much, and we want to emphasize, this isn't about saying yes to everything. It's not about getting every form of communications under your belt as a church. That's not going to be possible for most churches. But it is about knowing, why do some churches say yes to these things? We can't do everything, so we want to re-emphasize this overall idea of why we're doing church comms, and just give that picture of the general landscape and the questions that we're asking, so that we can better prioritize, and that we can know the place of church comms, I guess.
Yeah. Now, understandably, not every church will be investing loads and loads of time and money and resource into it, but every church should be at least thinking about it in some small way, because whether or not you have social media platforms or you have a website, every church actually is in the business of communicating with people.
Yeah.
Thinking about the usual sort of comms topics that we cover, here are a sort of couple of reasons why people say no. So often it's about theological concerns. The first often is sort of the digital versus the physical, or the real world sort of presence. There's the sort of belief that any meaningful ministry can only happen in person, and that anything that's done online and any form of digital engagement is less real, and there's sort of a less authenticity to it, and therefore it is less spiritual.
Yeah. And I think this is a skepticism about the digital relationships and community being able to be built online, and that means the churches can be hesitant to using digital platforms. Now, that isn't because churches are necessarily trying to take everything online and be fully digital. It's not a reaction to that, but I think the general skepticism about it and about that online community can then mean that we become resistant to churches doing anything digital at all.
Yeah. And there is often as well the sort of fear of diluting the gospel, and that, if we are making content that perhaps is leaning into the algorithms and the trends that are going on, that we might somehow compromise our theological integrity, or we become flippant, and that we're somehow turning the gospel into entertainment rather than what we're meant to be doing.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there are some pieces of content which are a little closer to that than I would personally feel comfortable with that churches share. But I think it's not saying you need to go that way, but it's saying that it doesn't need to be a half-hour sermon in order to be God's word.
Yeah.
And saying that when the vast majority of churches are sharing things online, they are seeking to do that in a God-honouring way that sticks to the gospel, but is just using modern methods to communicate it. So there's also sometimes there's a misunderstanding of the purpose of church comms and what we're trying to achieve, or the reasons for being there. And one of the sort of points of resistance that you can encounter is saying, well, none of our people are on social media anyway. Essentially, they're saying we're all too old.
It's all the old ones sharing the cat memes.
This is true. The reality is they probably are. There will be very small churches, very old people, and maybe they are too old to be on social media, perhaps. But that's not most churches. And actually, I think if you take a survey of your people and honestly ask them what social networks they're on, you might be surprised of how people spend their time.
Yeah.
Another thing that, I often hear is, we don't really need a website. We used to have one, but no one really used it.
Or we've got it and we don't know how to access it.
Yeah, let's not open that can of worms. But I think often this is a misunderstanding of like the reasons that you want a website and how people tend to use them. So, we've covered that before. Episode 16, we talked about church websites, and we talked about bad church websites and the job that they are meant to do, and therefore the job that you want to try to have them do. But it could also just be that your website was bad and that people didn't use it because it didn't have the most basic information. It wasn't kept up to date. So I think that these assumptions aren't necessarily based on truth. People don't use their website. Well, do you know that? Like maybe they use it and don't find it helpful. But even when the assumptions are correct, it may be there are reasons of why that was the case that you could solve. So the solution to all of these, and this applies wider to sort of general comms as we've talked about so often, knowing your audience. So knowing whether you're trying to get something to your internal audience or external outside of the church. And this thing about broadcasting to lots of people or narrowcasting, where you're trying to actually just kind of one-on-one share that message with people or share things with people. And then knowing the purpose of that piece of communication, that newsletter, that flyer, or that platform, that method of communication. What are you aiming to achieve with that? Are you aiming to invite someone to something? Are you aiming to update them on some news? Are you aiming to inspire them, educate them, tell them a little bit more about the gospel? And thinking through for each message of what you're going to do that, because that will help you to know why you're doing it. It'll help you to adjust your expectations and maybe commit time and maybe even money towards it. And as part of that, knowing the goal, keeping it simple and keeping things pointing in a direction towards the goal that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And then another sort of resistant reason that we come across is that we just don't have the resources. Now that could be time, money, people, typically all three of them. We just can't do it. And I think it's important to kind of break down each of that. So, if it's time, well, actually, are you using your time effectively for the reasons, as you've just said, about sort of audience purpose and goal? Actually, well, where is that time is best used effectively and efficiently?
Which can sound really patronizing when you're, we're saying that to a church leader who might have been doing it for decades even, but it's so, like, inertia is so powerful, and we may need to just reconsider our habits and say, we have been doing the same thing for so long, maybe the time is better spent elsewhere.
Yeah. And again, that's not a bad thing to look at, every 6 months ago, actually, is this the best use of my time? Perhaps I will experiment with something, or you're experimenting with something for a few months and then go, nope, don't think this is working for us. That's okay. If it's then sort of money is money is a resource concern, I think it's about thinking then about, well, what are we prioritizing our spending on? So actually, if we're doing a lot of print or I don't know, newspaper advertisements or something, and that actually that's seeing no returns, well, actually maybe it could be worth putting a bit of money into getting some good design system. Not that you have to pay for Canva or anything, but actually it's just prioritizing, what are we doing and where are we spending the money? Is there a better way of allocating that resource? And then obviously for people resource, and that is the challenge within the churches, because typically there are so few people already doing so many things. is there a way that you could find volunteers within the church family who could get involved, who could help out, could contribute, and even take ownership of aspects and elements within your comms or your digital exploration? It's not saying that you have to hand everything over, but could they help? Could they find things? Could they make things that actually then you're not having to make those resources or that content, but you can share it out?
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that the answer might be you genuinely don't have the time for these things. You might say, we absolutely can't be doing video right now. We can't be thinking about social media, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think to say a blanket no to thinking strategically about comms is a very different thing, because there will still be ways that you're communicating that it's worth having that sort of perspective on, and thinking about what you're putting out there and what people are receiving, how they're hearing about you. And yeah, just thinking carefully about those things, I think, is really important, even if you decide not to expand that into like a wider comms strategy.
Then there's often the I think it's, for me, one of the most infuriating, because there's no way of challenging it. We've always done it this way. Well, that's what we've always done, so I think if you're stuck in that attitude, I find that very difficult to try and offer solutions to that, because if you're stuck in the way that you've always done it, then you're always going to do it that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge of, cultural habits and tendencies. It's typically the people who are leading church are those who've grown up in the church, and they've been involved, and they're still doing church in the way that they were doing it when they were younger. And it is very difficult then to let go and to experiment and to try new things.
Yeah. And like going back to that thing of diluting the gospel, the gospel hasn't changed. So our church hasn't changed. Well, no, but the culture around you has.
Yeah.
Culture has changed, and people are consuming things differently. We have people who, whole generations of people who have grown up with digital, and they don't know life without it. Digital natives, that sort of,
Yeah.
And so we need to be thinking about how to engage with them in a different way. And that's not an unbiblical thing to do. In fact, I think it's a very biblical thing to do.
Exactly.
I think we see that in the Bible, that people will adapt their message to the people they're around. Think of Paul preaching. He adapts his message. He's not changing the truth of what he's saying, but he's presenting it in a different way to the different people in that culture.
Yeah. And it's as well as not just thinking about who's within your church. So, okay, maybe you are an older congregation and you don't have a lot of digital natives. That's okay. Like, again, it's accepting what you've got. But actually, who's in your community? If, I don't know, you're a fairly quiet town or something, and it is a sort of older, more retirement age, but then suddenly there is this new housing development built, and there's schools, and there's now a lot more younger people, there's more professionals, younger active professionals or families coming in. Actually, suddenly that does change the dynamics of your community. And
absolutely. If you have a church of sort of 10 or 15 people and you've got a family of 4 come in, that will be a huge dynamic shift.
Yeah.
And you might say, oh, well, they're not going to come in. Well, if you're not trying to meet them where they're at, to the point where they might not even hear that you exist, well, then no, they're probably not going to come in. But that's not about saying it's all your responsibility either. It's just saying, look, if there's people around who are different to you, then think about how you communicate to them.
Yeah.
So another point of resistance might be fear. The fear that if you do it, your engagement might not be high enough. Whatever high engagement looks like, you will have churches of hundreds of thousands of followers and that sort of thing, and their levels for high engagement are going to be very different to yours. But there's a sense of, what does it matter? Because it's not about the numbers, and your posts for 6 months might get 1 or 2 likes at most. But if someone who's moved into a community sees those posts and finds out about your church, or is just even the slightest bit intrigued, then the posts are doing something. They're meeting your goal to some extent of reaching people. Engagement and metrics like that is not something to obsess over, and it's definitely not a reason not to do it. I think there's this fear of failure with it. I don't know what failure looks like. You might try something new and it might not go great. Well, okay, so maybe you find that it's not for you, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you've failed. Just because you don't see a huge amount of fruit from it doesn't mean you've failed. Yeah.
But actually better to know that doesn't work for you than sort of go, oh no, well we didn't, no, I don't want to try at all. At least you know, actually, yeah, we did try it. No, maybe we'll try it again in a couple of years or something. But actually right now, we don't have the resource. And at least you're not wondering that maybe it's not working.
And I think another thing is the fear of sort of resistance, the fear of sort of criticism or negativity online, like trolls and that sort of thing. And it can be an issue, but I think generally, unless you are reaching a bigger audience, it's fairly unlikely. And if it is the occasional comment, then that's nothing that you can't handle. And hopefully it's maybe even an opportunity for good. And that's something we talked about way back in the 3rd ever episode of this podcast, where we talked about like responding to negativity. So yeah, if that is something that you're concerned about, then go and have a listen to that.
Yeah. So can churches survive without a comm strategy? I mean, I'd rather you didn't, but of course, it's God who brings the growth. These are just tools to help us sort of along the way. But that I really don't think it means that we should just write off any new way of reaching people. We should be using everything that we can, anything at our disposal to introduce the message of the gospel to those around us. As much as we can, and very often we do get caught up in the intricacies of, specific metrics or, the new social platform, design trends. It's this core vision we need to keep at the center of it all. What is the purpose? What is the goal? Does this help the kingdom?
Yeah.
Because if we do that and cover everything in prayer, really, there's no way of failing, because it's not about the numbers.
No.
It's about communicating the gospel. And if you're doing all that you can, that's not a failure to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you encounter these sorts of comments or these resistances to doing church comms in whatever form, then share this podcast with people, and hopefully it's a good way of getting them to think. And if you have thought in this way before and you're still really unsure, then give it a go. Yeah. If your church hasn't engaged with comms in this way, give it a go, and we'd love to hear how you get on.
Gourds and Pomegranates is brought to you by Joe Gallant and Hannah Fleming Hill. You can find episode transcripts and contact the show via gppodcast.uk.